Feel the heavy, metallic pulse of a world driven by ambition, power, and the constant search for ultimate justice. We bring you the raw intensity of the human experience through a sharp, 3D cinematic lens of modern storytelling. Subscribe now and keep your finger on the pulse of the action.
The rain had been coming down since Tuesday, the kind of steady, gray Ontario rain that settles in like it has nowhere else to be. I was standing in the doorway of my home office. Just standing in the doorway of my home office. Just standing there, coffee going cold in my hand, when I noticed the drawer. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, where everything goes slow and the music shifts. I just noticed it was open about 2 centimeters when I always keep it flush. 31 years as a fraud investigator with the Ontario Securities Commission teaches you certain things about yourself. One of them is this: you don't leave drawers open. You don't leave anything the way it wasn't. I set the coffee down on the bookshelf, walked over slowly. The drawer held my personal files, pension documents, the deed to the house, my late wife Patricia's life insurance settlement, the updated will I'd had drawn up last March. Everything was still there. But the order was wrong. The deed sat on top, when I always filed it behind the insurance papers. The will had been unfolded and refolded along a crease that didn't match the original. Someone had gone through this drawer carefully, trying to put it back the way they found it. Close, but not close enough. I didn't say anything at dinner that night. My son-in-law was visiting. He'd been staying with us, him and my daughter, for the past 3 months while their condo renovation dragged on. I watched him cut his chicken and make small talk about the Leafs, and I thought about fingerprints on paper. About a will refolded along the wrong crease. My daughter brought it up herself, almost casually, clearing the plates. "Dad, have you thought any more about the Muskoka property? What you're planning to do with it?" The Muskoka property. Her grandfather, my father, had left me a cottage on a lake outside Huntsville. Modest place, but the land itself, 2 acres on the water, was worth somewhere north of $800,000 in today's market. "Not recently," I said. "Why?" She smiled, the way she does when she's preparing something. "Derek and I were just talking. It's sitting empty most of the year. It might make sense to think about it practically. Before." She stopped. "Before what?" I wanted to ask. "Before I'm too old to decide for myself?" Derek didn't look up from stacking napkins, but his jaw was tight. "I'll think about it," I said. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain and didn't sleep for a long time. The thing people misunderstand about fraud is that it rarely looks like fraud from the inside. From the inside, it looks like concern. It looks like family taking an interest. It looks like a daughter asking reasonable questions over dinner about property that does, objectively, sit empty for most of the year. You have to train yourself to see underneath the surface, to read the structure of what's being built, rather than just the face of it. 31 years gave me that. I wasn't sure whether to be grateful or devastated that I was using it now on my own child. I started watching differently after that. Derek left the house at irregular hours, sometimes twice in an afternoon. He took calls in the garage. Once, coming home early from my walk, I found him in my office doorway, phone pressed to his ear. He startled when he saw me. Said he'd been looking for a pen. My daughter, meanwhile, began raising the subject of my memory with a frequency that felt rehearsed. Small things. "Dad, didn't you say we were having pasta tonight? You seemed confused." And this one I almost admired for its precision. "You left the stove element on again. 3rd time this month." I hadn't left any element on. I started writing things down. Dates, times, what was said, what I observed, old habit. The kind of documentation that holds up. Then in the 2nd week of March, I found the envelope. It had been tucked inside a legal pad in Derek's temporary workspace in the spare bedroom, the one he used as his office. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a phone charger he'd borrowed, but the envelope had slipped halfway out from under the pad, and the return address was from a law office in Barrie I didn't recognize. I didn't open it. I photographed the outside, slid it back exactly as I'd found it, and left. That evening, I called an old colleague, Helen Marsh, retired Crown attorney, sharp as the day I'd worked across from her on a securities case in 2009. I told her what I'd seen. What I'd been seeing. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure you want to know?" she asked. "I spent 31 years making sure people couldn't lie about money and get away with it," I said. "Yes, I want to know." "Then you need to do this carefully," she said. "Because if you're right, they're going to claim you're incompetent. That means everything you do from here has to be airtight and documented before they realize you're watching. Careful. Documented. Airtight. The language of my entire working life, now applied to my own kitchen table. The plan came together over a week. My sister lives in Halifax. She'd been asking me to visit for 2 years. I announced at dinner one Thursday that I was going to fly out and spend a few weeks. My daughter's reaction was almost too enthusiastic. She cleared the table twice as fast as usual. Derek said, "That's great, that's really great," and then excused himself to the garage. I booked a flight. I packed a bag. I drove to the airport on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, parked the car in long term, checked in, went through security, and then I walked back out through the domestic arrivals doors and took a cab to a motel in Orangeville, 40 minutes west of home. It was called the Lakeview Motor Inn, which was funny because there was no lake visible from any window. I paid cash for a week. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and central heating. I sat on the edge of the bed and called my sister. "You're not coming," she said immediately. "I will," I said. "Just not yet. I need you to cover for me if anyone calls." A pause. "Gerald." Her voice had that particular weight she'd used with me since we were children, when she knew I was doing something complicated. "Be careful." I ate a sandwich I'd packed from home. I watched the local news. Then I waited for dark. My neighbor to the east is a man named Bill Kowalski, retired school teacher, widower, keeps odd hours because he's an insomniac, and tends his garden before 6 in the morning. I'd known Bill for 18 years. His property shares a fence line with mine, and his kitchen window looks directly into the side yard of my house. Bill had no idea I was still in Ontario. But when I knocked on his back door at 8 in the evening, he opened it without much surprise, looked at me for a moment, and said, "I was wondering when you'd come." I stared at him. "Get inside," he said. "I've got things to tell you." Bill had seen Derek leave with boxes on the Saturday after I supposedly flew to Halifax. Cardboard filing boxes, the kind with lids, 3 of them, loaded into the back of his SUV. He'd also seen a woman he didn't recognize walk the perimeter of my property on Sunday afternoon, stopping at the lot lines, checking her phone, occasionally crouching to photograph something at ground level. A surveyor, I thought, or someone acting like one. There was a car Tuesday evening as well, Bill said, pouring tea I hadn't asked for and putting it in front of me. "Parked in front of your place for about 40 minutes. Man in his 50s, I'd say. Dark coat, went inside with Derek. Did you see what he looked like?" Bill slid a piece of paper across the table. He'd written down the license plate. I sat very still for a moment. "Bill, when did you write this down?" "Sunday," he said. "When I saw the boxes going out, I thought—" He paused. "I thought you should know whenever you came back." Whenever you came back. He'd known, or suspected, that the trip wasn't what it appeared to be. 18 years of early mornings over a shared fence line. "I need to ask a favor," I said. "I know you do," he said. "Tell me what you need." What I needed was a vantage point and a witness. Bill's second-floor bathroom window faced my driveway and the front of my house directly. From there, with the light off, you could see everything that moved on my property without being visible from outside. I discovered this accidentally years ago when I'd locked myself out and was assessing options. Bill gave me a key. 3 nights of watching. I kept notes in a small moleskin I'd bought at the pharmacy. The first night was quiet. Lights on inside. Derek's car in the driveway. My daughter's Subaru beside it. No visitors. This second night, the same woman I'd been told about arrived at 7, a canvas bag over one shoulder. She stayed 2 hours. When she left, she carried the bag differently, fuller, heavier. I photographed her through the window with my phone. Not great images, but enough. The third night was when it happened. I was upstairs in Bill's bathroom. No chair, just standing, back aching after an hour, when headlights came down the street at 11:15. A gray Volvo sedan. It pulled into my driveway with a kind of unhurried confidence, like it belonged there, and a man got out in his sport jacket despite the cold. He checked his phone, then went directly to the front door without hesitating. Derek opened it before he knocked. Bill appeared in the doorway behind me, holding 2 mugs. He took one look at the Volvo and said quietly, "That's the same man from Tuesday." We stood together in the dark and watched the lights of my house. Through the living room window, with the curtains not quite meeting, I could see 3 figures around my dining table. My daughter wasn't among them, just Derek, the man in the sport jacket, and someone I couldn't make out clearly, a third person who'd arrived separately, probably through the back. They spread papers across the table. The man in the jacket examined them with the practiced attention of someone checking documents professionally. Bill had set his phone to record, propped on the windowsill. It wasn't enough to see. I needed to hear. At 12:40, they moved toward the front door. The street was empty and cold. The neighborhood settled into sleep. We eased the bathroom window open, Bill's suggestion, his house, and the night air came in sharp with the smell of early spring mud. The man in the sport jacket spoke first, professional and unhurried. "If the transfer documentation holds, we can move on the Huntsville property before end of April. The buyer's motivated, and this structure has advantages." Derek's voice, the power of attorney, is solid. He signed it in December. I hadn't signed it in December. I hadn't signed anything in December. I hadn't signed any power of attorney, ever, for anyone regarding anything. "There may be questions about cognitive capacity," the man said. It wasn't a concern. It was a rehearsed contingency, worth having that documentation ready. My daughter's voice came from further back, near the door, lower than the men's. "His doctor's appointment is next month. We can work with that." Bill's hand found my shoulder briefly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They said their goodbyes at the door with the subdued cordiality of people who've finished a productive business meeting. The man in the sport jacket got into the Volvo and reversed out without turning on his lights until he reached the street. Careful. Practiced. Derek and my daughter went inside. The porch light went off. Bill closed the window. We stood in the dark bathroom, without speaking for a moment. "Gerald," he said finally. "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" I thought about 31 years of understanding how people hide things and how you expose them. I thought about my father, who'd built that cottage himself over 3 summers in the 1970s. I thought about Patricia, who'd loved it more than any place on earth. "I'm going to let them believe it's working," I said, "and then I'm going to take it all apart." I went back to the motel that night and didn't sleep. I sat at the small table by the window with my Moloxine open and wrote down everything. Times, words, descriptions, every detail while it was sharp. Wrote it the way I'd written investigative notes for 3 decades. Precise, specific, emotionless on the surface. The emotion, I knew, would come later when there was room for it. The next morning I called Helen. "They forged a power of attorney," I said. "Dated December. And someone is preparing to argue cognitive decline." A long pause. "You need to move faster than they are," she said. "I know who to call." James Okoro had practiced estate and property law in Toronto for 20 years. I'd encountered him twice on OSC matters and found him methodical in a way that I respected, the kind of lawyer who treated evidence like something sacred. I drove into the city and sat across from him in his Queen Street office that same afternoon. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, he asked to see the Moleskine. Read through it carefully, asked 3 questions, sat back. The forged power of attorney is fraudulent if you never signed it, he said, but we have to establish that clearly and early. First, a sworn affidavit that you have never executed any power of attorney or authorization regarding your property or finances. Notarized today, if possible. Second, he turned to his computer. We look at placing the Muskoka property and your primary residence into a trust structure, one that predates whatever they're planning, so any documentation they've created is legally inert. Can we date the trust before December? He looked at me. We can establish the trust as of today and document clearly that your intention and instruction has been consistent. That's different from backdating, which I won't do, but if the forged document is dated December and your trust structure is in place now, before any transaction occurs, they have nothing actionable. I nodded. Then let's start. We worked for 3 hours. James drafted the trust documents while I went 2 blocks over to a notary I'd used for years, retired court notary, completely discreet, and swore the affidavit. Signed in front of her with 2 witnesses. She sealed it with the kind of deliberate formality that I'd always found quietly satisfying. One document against everything they'd constructed. James filed the property trust with the county that same day. He also flagged my accounts at my bank, account holds requiring my physical presence and photo ID for any transaction involving the properties. The branch manager, a careful woman named Annette, who'd handled my accounts for a decade, listened to a partial explanation and acted without requiring the rest. I've seen this before, she said. More than you'd think. On the way back to Orangeville, I stopped at a hardware store, bought a small audio recorder and a micro camera, the kind you might use for home security, no larger than a pack of cards. Back at the motel, I thought about what came next. The legal structure was in place. The affidavit existed. The trust was filed. Whatever forged documents they'd assembled were now functionally worthless, but that wasn't the same as stopping them. For that, I needed them to walk into something they couldn't back away from. I called Bill. I'm coming home Thursday, I said, cutting the trip short. I need you to be available, and I need you to not react to anything you hear me say at the house over the next few days. Understood, he said. Gerald, do you want me to be ready to say what I saw? If it comes to that, yes. Then I'm ready. I drove home on a Thursday afternoon, arriving just before 5. My daughter's car was in the driveway. I could see the kitchen light on. I parked, took my bag from the trunk with the slow movements of someone who'd been traveling, and opened the front door. I'm home, I called. Flight was changed. Halifax wasn't. I paused, feigning a kind of trailing confusion. There was some mix-up with the connection. My daughter appeared from the kitchen. For a fraction of a second, her face was unguarded. Calculation, adjustment, recovery. Before the warmth came in. Dad, you should have called. Are you all right? You look tired. Just tired, I said. Long trip. Derek came downstairs and shook my hand with the warmth of a man managing a situation. Good to have you back. You must be exhausted. Don't worry about anything around here. Don't worry about anything around here. I filed it away. I let myself be handled that evening, sat in my own armchair and appeared to half doze through the news. Let them bring me tea. Let my daughter straighten the cushions around me with the solicitous attention of someone practicing for a proceeding in which she'd need to demonstrate she'd been caring for a declining father. I watched from behind half-closed eyes. They talked low in the kitchen. I'd placed the small recorder on the shelf behind the cookbooks that morning, before they were awake. Over the next 2 days, they worked steadily at establishing the narrative. My daughter mentioned the stove element again. 3rd or 4th time now, Dad, we've all noticed. Derek suggested gently that it might be worth talking to someone, just to have a baseline. My daughter produced a pamphlet which she left on the side table as if by accident, about a memory clinic in Mississauga. Each time I nodded vaguely, said things like, I suppose I have been a bit scattered lately. Watched their faces relax. Meanwhile, I was recording everything. On the 2nd evening, I found the moment I needed. Derek was on his phone in the kitchen, thinking I was watching television in the other room. Still on for the 28th. He's definitely not right. No, I'm telling you, he has no idea. She's got him believing he signed things in December that he can't even remember now. Yeah, the Barrie office is handling the transfer. Once it's through. A pause. Then we're done. Then we're done. I sat in my armchair with my hands folded in my lap and breathed. The 28th was 11 days away. The week that followed required a kind of performance I hadn't known I was capable of. Every morning, appearing uncertain. Leaving questions half finished. Apologizing for things I hadn't forgotten. My daughter, to her credit, played her role with genuine skill. She was patient with me, solicitous, warm in the performance of concern. If I hadn't known what was underneath it, I might have found it comforting. I spent my evenings in my home office, going through the recorder files on my laptop. I had Derek clearly, twice, discussing the transfer and the timeline. I had my daughter in the kitchen telling someone on the phone, voice low, almost affectionate in its confidence. He thinks he's just being forgetful. He's not going to challenge anything. I had the midnight meeting reconstructed from Bill's footage and my notes timestamped. I had Jane Zakora reviewing all of it and telling me that what we had was not only sufficient, but, in his words, unusually comprehensive. Most people in this situation don't have your background, he said. Most people don't know to document. They find out after the fact, and the paper trail is gone. I know, I said. That's what they were counting on. He filed with two agencies simultaneously, the Law Society of Ontario, because the man in the sport jacket turned out to be a real estate lawyer named Timothy Walsh, and the Ontario Securities Commission's Property Fraud Unit, where I still had contacts who picked up on the second ring. The closing was scheduled for the 28th, 2 p.m., at a title company office in Barrie. On the morning of the 28th, I put on a suit I hadn't worn in 3 years, navy. Conservative, the tie Patricia had given me for my last Christmas before she got sick. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and felt something settle back into place that had been dislodged for weeks. I drove to Barrie alone. James met me in the lobby of the building at 1:45. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been doing this since before you were called to the bar," I said. He smiled, which I appreciated. The conference room was on the 3rd floor. Through the glass, I could see them assembling. Derek at the table, reviewing papers with a kind of forced composure. My daughter beside him, her coat still on, her hands folded too neatly. Timothy Walsh at the head, arranging documents with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. A buyer's representative across from him, a man in his 40s who'd driven down from Huntsville with every reason to believe this was a straightforward transaction. I opened the door. The conversation stopped. My daughter stood up halfway and caught herself. Derek's face did something complicated. Walsh looked at me and went very still. I walked to the end of the table opposite Walsh, set my briefcase down with a deliberate click, and looked around the room. "My name is Gerald McKinnon," I said. "I'm the sole owner of the Huntsville property you're attempting to purchase today. This transaction cannot proceed." The buyer's representative said, "I'm sorry, who?" "The power of attorney you've been provided was forged," I said. "I never signed it. I have a notarized affidavit to that effect, filed at the time, and I have audio recordings from the past 2 weeks establishing that the individuals in this room were aware the document was unauthorized and intended to use cognitive decline as a defense against challenge." I opened my briefcase. I also have the trust documentation showing the property transferred into an irrevocable structure before any of the paperwork you've prepared was executed, which makes every document in your file legally inert. I placed the folders in front of James, who distributed them with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Walsh was on his feet. "This is highly irregular. You met in my house at 11:15 p.m. on March 19th, I said, looking at him directly. "You discussed the transfer timeline and the plan to invoke cognitive decline if I challenge the documentation. I have a recording and a witness who observed and filmed your arrival." I placed a printed photograph on the table. "That's your Volvo in my driveway. The timestamp is 11:14 p.m. The buyer's representative had already picked up his phone. Derek said, "Dad." "Don't," I said. It came out quiet, quieter than I'd expected. There's nothing to say. My daughter looked at me across the table, not with anger, which I could have understood, not with fear, which I'd expected, just with something that looked, for a moment, very much like grief. Maybe she hadn't believed it would come to this. Maybe she'd told herself a version of it in which I was genuinely declining and they were genuinely helping. I don't know. I'll never fully know. This closing is terminated, said the escrow officer, who'd been reviewing documents throughout and who now closed her folder with a finality that was unmistakable. I'll be contacting the Law Society and making a report to the appropriate authorities. Walsh gathered his briefcase without speaking. The buyer's representative was already in the hallway, on his phone, voice low and furious. My daughter sat back down. I picked up my folders, returned them to my briefcase, and closed it. Looked at Derek, who was staring at the table. Looked at my daughter, who was looking at her hands. I spent 31 years making sure people couldn't take things that didn't belong to them, I said. I'm sorry it had to include you. I walked out. The hallway was bright and quiet. James fell into step beside me. The Law Society referral is already filed, he said. Walsh could lose his license. The fraud unit will be in contact with Derek by end of week. I know. Gerald, you know what happens now. Criminal proceedings, possibly. I know what happens now, I said. I've known what happens now since I was 32 years old and watching someone's father go through exactly this. We took the elevator to the lobby. Outside, Barrie was gray and March cold, the lake just visible at the end of the street. Bill called as I reached my car. How did it go? He asked. The way it needed to, I said. A pause. Are you all right? I stood with my hand on the door handle and thought about that, about the Muskoka cottage, and the way the light comes off the lake in early morning, which Patricia had photographed once and I still had on my phone, about my daughter's face when I said I was sorry, about the drawer left open 2 centimeters. I will be, I said. The proceedings took the shape I had anticipated. Derek retained a lawyer and initially contested everything until the recordings were presented during the preliminary stages and the contesting became considerably quieter. My daughter, on advice of her own counsel, entered a statement of cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Walsh faced a Law Society investigation and had his license suspended pending review. The formal sentencing came on a Thursday in late June. Maricopa, no, I'm sorry, Old Habit. In an Ontario Superior courtroom I'd never been inside as a civilian. I sat in a public gallery. My daughter stood at the front of the room and didn't turn around. The judge read from the victim impact statement I had submitted about what it means to be investigated by your own child. About building a case against someone you taught to tell the truth. Derek received 18 months of probation, a significant fine, and 200 hours of community service. My daughter received 12 months of probation, a fine, and a conditional discharge that would clear her record if she completed the terms. Walsh was still before the Law Society. I walked out into a June afternoon that was finely warm, the kind of day that makes Ontario feel like it earned summer. Bill was waiting on a bench across the street. He stood when he saw me, and we shook hands the way men who've known each other for 18 years shake hands, which is not the way you do it with anyone else. Property's secure? He asked. Fully. Trust is in place. Accounts are locked. Everything's protected. He nodded. And what now? I'd been thinking about that. At my old office, there's a unit that deals specifically with financial elder abuse, cases where family members exploit aging relatives and count on shame or cognitive vulnerability to keep them silent. I knew the current director. I'd started drafting an email. There are people who don't have my background, I said, who don't know how to document, who find out after everything is gone. You're going back in? Bill asked. Consulting, I said, not full-time. But I know how this works, and it turns out that's useful. I drove home through the late afternoon, past the turnoff for Highway 400 North that would take me up toward Muskoka. I didn't take it today, but I thought about it. I thought about opening the cottage for the first time since Patricia died, which I hadn't been able to do, which had maybe been part of what made it a target. My grief, my absence from the place. I thought about driving up there on a long weekend when the lake was clear, making coffee in the small kitchen, sitting on the dock. It was still mine. That was the thing. After everything, it was still mine. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The house was quiet. Bill was in his garden next door, hat on against the sun, doing something deliberate with his hands. Some betrayals don't heal. That's not pessimism. It's accuracy. The same kind of accuracy I'd spent my career insisting on. My daughter had looked at my home and my property and seen an opportunity before she saw a father. I couldn't unknow that. Couldn't pretend the drawer had never been open. But I could refuse to be defined by what they'd tried to do. Could choose instead to be defined by what I'd done in response. Carefully, methodically, without cruelty, within the law. The way I'd always tried to do things, I got out of the car, went inside, put the kettle on. The house was exactly as I'd left it. The files of my office, in their proper order. The drawer flush. Everything where I'd put it. That, in the end, was all I'd wanted. I've been sitting with this for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the legal part. I understood that before any of it happened. I mean the human part. The part that stays with you at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and you're not thinking about trust documents or recorded conversations. You're just thinking about your daughter's face across that conference table in Barrie. Here's what I keep coming back to. What Derek and my daughter built wasn't just a fraud. It was a story. A story in which I was confused, declining, incapable. A man who needed to be managed rather than respected. And the thing about a story like that is, it only works if the person at the center of it believes it too, even a little. They were counting on me to doubt myself. To think, maybe I did leave that element on. Maybe I am more scattered than I realize. That self-doubt was the actual mechanism of the whole scheme. The forged documents were just paperwork. The real forgery was the one they were trying to do on my sense of myself. I didn't let them, not because I'm exceptional, but because 31 years of watching people construct false narratives gave me the reflex to ask what's actually true here and what's being built to look true. Most people don't have that reflex. Most people, when someone they love tells them they're confused, feel confused. That's not weakness. That's what love does to your defenses. What I learned, what I'd want anyone in a similar position to understand, is that paying attention is not paranoia. Trusting your own memory of what you did and didn't sign is not stubbornness. Writing things down, keeping records, noticing when a drawer is 2 centimeters open, when it's never 2 centimeters open, that's not eccentricity. That's just taking your own life seriously. Bill took it seriously too. He saw those boxes going into Derek's SUV on a Saturday morning, and he wrote down a license plate because something felt wrong, even though he had no framework to understand why. That instinct, the willingness to act on what you notice, to not talk yourself out of it, is worth more than most people realize. Bill didn't have my background. He had 18 years of knowing his neighbor well enough to know when something wasn't right. That counted for everything. And Helen. Helen asked me on the phone whether I was sure I wanted to know. I've thought about that question a lot. There's a version of this story where I don't want to know, where I let myself believe the drawer had just been left open by accident, go to Halifax, come home to find the property sold and the money gone, and no recourse because I'd done nothing to protect myself. Some people make that choice, not because they're foolish. Because the alternative, knowing, means you have to act on what you know. And acting on it, when the people involved are your own family, costs something that doesn't have a legal name. I paid that cost. I'd pay it again. Not because consequences don't matter, or because I felt nothing walking out of that room in Barrie. I felt everything. But there's a difference between feeling the weight of something and being crushed by it. I chose not to be crushed. That, in the end, is the only choice any of us actually controls.